The morning I walked outside and discovered my car had disappeared for the third Monday in a row. I stood frozen in my driveway wondering how one person could enjoy making someone else's life so miserable. At that moment, I had no idea that the wealthy man living across the street would soon lose everything he had spent decades building, all because he believed money could protect him from the consequences of his own actions. My name is Ethan Parker, and until a year ago, I believed that hard work and treating people with respect were enough to build a peaceful life in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Denver, Colorado. After years of saving every extra dollar from my job as an electrical technician, I finally bought my first home, never imagining that my biggest challenge wouldn't come from paying the mortgage, but from living across the street from one of the most arrogant men I had ever met. That man was Richard Caldwell, a wealthy real estate developer who owned several luxury apartment buildings across the city and made sure everyone around him knew exactly how successful he was every single day. He drove a different luxury car almost every week, hosted loud parties attended by local politicians and business leaders, and treated the rest of the neighborhood as if we were simply background characters in the story of his perfect life. The problems began only a few days after I moved in, when Richard walked onto my property without introducing himself and casually informed me that my pickup truck made the street look cheap whenever his guests arrived for dinner. I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking, but the cold expression on his face told me he expected me to apologize for owning a vehicle that wasn't expensive enough to meet his impossible standards. Less than a week later, I stepped outside before sunrise to leave for work and found nothing but an empty parking space where my truck had been the night before, and after several frantic phone calls, I learned it had been towed because someone had reported it as illegally parked. As I stood in the towing company's office paying hundreds of dollars to recover a truck that had been legally parked the entire time, I noticed a familiar black luxury SUV slowly driving past the window, and behind the wheel sat Richard Caldwell, smiling directly at me before disappearing down the road. When I finally got my truck back that afternoon, I carefully checked every parking regulation on my street, measured the distance from the driveway, and even took photos of where I parked so no one could falsely accuse me again. Deep down, I wanted to believe the first towing incident had been a misunderstanding, but Richard's smug smile kept replaying in my mind, making it impossible to ignore the feeling that none of this was an accident. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening almost every day, and each incident seemed carefully planned to make my life as stressful as possible without leaving obvious proof of who was behind it. I received anonymous complaints about my lawn being too long, my trash cans being left out too early, and even accusations that my porch light was disturbing the neighborhood, despite several neighbors quietly telling me they had never noticed a single problem with my property. One Saturday morning, while I was washing my truck in the driveway, Richard strolled across the street wearing an expensive designer suit and a smile that looked more like a warning than a greeting. He casually told me that people with average incomes should learn to stay in neighborhoods they could actually fit into, then walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there wondering how someone could speak to another human being with so much arrogance. The following Monday, history repeated itself when I walked outside before work and discovered my truck had vanished again, even though it had been parked in the exact same legal spot I had photographed the night before. This time, the towing company admitted they had received another anonymous complaint claiming my vehicle was blocking emergency access, but when I asked for the name of the caller, they explained that company policy protected the identity of whoever reported it. That evening, instead of reacting with anger, I sat quietly on my front porch watching Richard's mansion come alive as expensive cars filled his circular driveway and well-dressed guests laughed beneath sparkling lights that could probably be seen from space. As I watched him confidently shaking hands with influential people, I made a promise to myself that I would stop being the victim, because sooner or later everyone makes a mistake, and I had a feeling Richard Caldwell's biggest mistake was still waiting to happen. The next morning, instead of heading straight to work, I stopped by a small security company and spent part of my savings on for high-definition cameras that covered every angle of my driveway, front yard, and the street in front of my house. If Richard was determined to make my life miserable, I decided the best way to fight back wasn't with anger or revenge, but with undeniable evidence that no amount of money could erase. Within just a few days, the cameras started capturing strange activity during the early hours of the morning, including unfamiliar vehicles slowing down in front of my house and people taking pictures before quietly driving away. Then, on the fourth night, one of the cameras recorded a man getting out of a black SUV, walking around my truck with a flashlight, taking several photographs and making a phone call before quickly leaving. While the same black SUV looked remarkably similar to the one Richard drove almost every day, I shared the footage with my next-door neighbor, Linda Brooks, a retired school principal who had lived on the street for more than 20 years and seemed genuinely disturbed by what she saw on the screen. After watching the recording several times, she quietly admitted that I wasn't the first person Richard had targeted, explaining that the other families had moved away after months of relentless harassment that mysteriously stopped the moment they sold their homes. Linda went on to tell me something that made the entire situation feel even darker, saying Richard had a habit of pressuring homeowners to leave whenever he became interested in buying their properties for one of his development projects. Most people never challenged him because he had a powerful legal team, influential friends in city government, and a reputation for making life incredibly difficult for anyone who stood in his way. That night, as I reviewed the camera footage one more time, I noticed something I had completely missed before: a white delivery van pulling into Richard's driveway long after midnight, with several large, unmarked boxes being unloaded into his garage by men who looked far too nervous for a routine delivery. I couldn't explain why, but every instinct told me that whatever was hidden inside those boxes had absolutely nothing to do with real estate. And for the first time, I realized this story might be much bigger than a neighborhood feud. Over the next 2 weeks, I stopped thinking like a frustrated neighbor and started paying attention like someone trying to solve a puzzle, carefully documenting every unusual vehicle that entered Richard's property and every late-night delivery that seemed designed to avoid attention. The more I observed, the clearer it became that his mansion wasn't just the home of a wealthy businessman, it was the center of activities that made even the most confident people arrive looking nervous and leave without saying a word. One Friday evening, while I was taking my trash to the curb, a delivery driver accidentally walked up to my porch instead of Richard's and quietly apologized before asking if the large house across the street belonged to Mr. Caldwell. Before leaving, the driver leaned closer and whispered that something about those deliveries never felt right because the shipping labels rarely matched the contents, and he had watched expensive electronic equipment disappear into the garage without ever appearing on any official inventory forms. That conversation convinced me I wasn't imagining things. So, instead of confronting Richard, I organized every photo, video, and written note I had collected into a detailed timeline and contacted a state agency that investigated financial crimes and commercial fraud. I never accused Richard of a specific crime because I didn't know exactly what was happening, but I explained the repeated harassment, the suspicious deliveries, and the evidence suggesting his influence was being used to intimidate homeowners. 3 days later, just before sunrise, I looked out my front window and nearly dropped my coffee when several unmarked SUVs quietly rolled into the neighborhood, followed by investigators carrying folders and sealed evidence cases. Instead of flashing lights or loud sirens, they approached Richard's mansion with calm confidence, knocked on the front door, and within minutes more officials arrived, securing the property while confused neighbors stepped outside to see what was happening. Richard finally walked out onto his front porch wearing the same confident smile he always displayed, but it disappeared the moment an investigator handed him an official warrant and began directing teams into every room of his massive home. As agents carried box after box of documents, computers, and locked storage cases to waiting vehicles, Richard slowly turned toward my house, and for the first time since I'd moved into the neighborhood, I didn't see arrogance in his eyes. I saw pure fear. By the following afternoon, every local news station in Denver had parked outside our neighborhood, broadcasting live as reporters revealed that investigators had been building a financial fraud case against Richard Caldwell for months before my report helped connect several missing pieces. According to the first public statements, authorities suspected that millions of dollars had been hidden through shell companies, fraudulent real estate transactions, and fake property records that stretched across multiple states. As more details became public, former employees began coming forward with stories they had been too afraid to tell, describing years of intimidation, forged paperwork, unpaid contractors, and threats. Whenever someone questioned Richard's business practices, families who had quietly moved away from the neighborhood also contacted investigators, explaining how they had been harassed until they finally gave up and sold their homes, allowing Richard to purchase several properties far below their actual market value. Less than 2 weeks later, Richard's luxury cars disappeared from his driveway. Foreclosure notices were posted on the front gate of his mansion, and the same neighbors he had spent years looking down on watched moving trucks haul away the expensive furniture that once symbolized his untouchable lifestyle. Ironically, the man who had laughed while my truck was being towed was now standing helplessly on the sidewalk as his own possessions were legally removed. Under court supervision, one quiet evening, as I finished watering my lawn, Richard slowly walked across the street looking older and more exhausted than I had ever seen him, stopping a few feet away before lowering his head and quietly apologizing for everything he had done. He admitted that power and wealth had convinced him he could control anyone he wanted, but losing his business, his reputation, and nearly everything he owned had taught him a lesson no amount of money could buy. As I watched him walk away for what would be the last time before he moved out of the neighborhood, I realized that revenge had never been what brought me peace. The truth had, because real karma doesn't need anger to do its job. It simply waits until every choice finally catches up with the person who made it. If there's one lesson this experience taught me, it's that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and those who build their success by hurting others eventually discover that the strongest foundation is honesty, because sooner or later, karma always finds the right address. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.